Hi, and welcome to this presentation on board reporting, making it easy. For over 20 years, riskHive have delivered innovative software solutions supported by subject matter expert training and consulting that helps organisations to better manage risk and uncertainty, delivering improved customer confidence to stakeholders, and I'm proud to be presenting today on behalf of riskHive. I'm Rebecca, and I have been a risk practitioner for over 20 years, and having worked in a number of organisations, have had the pleasure of, over several years, to read and write a good many risk reports. From the readers' and writers' perspective, I have in general found them to be too long, too detailed, and often punctuated with the inevitable heat map as a means of visualising risk data. And I'm convinced that often these are in reports just to have some kind of visual. Where data is provided, all too often this only shows the negligible improvement trends over a time period since the last report, or is punctuated and produced in a tabular way that would make the most enthusiastic analysts glaze over. As a reader, these types of reports dull the senses and do little to stimulate conversation. As a writer, it's demoralising to report on a subject that appears to have had so little traction since the previous reporting period. And for the time that these reports seems to take to produce, just seems absurd. And if you feel that things are bad for you, remember, if you're feeling the hurt in creating the report, place yourself in the board's shoes, who have to read them. As a board or executive member, reports come to them on a regular basis, and often a number of different functions will send their reports all in the same week due to the reporting calendar, so they have to read several reports in a short amount of time, all of which require them to make decisions or direct resources. So it's really important not to make these reports a vanity report on risk management and telling them things that they already know, but rather give your audience something that they can act on and enable them to make a difference. I appreciate that there are governance requirements that dictate certain elements to be covered as part of risk reporting. For example, your compliance function may require you to provide an evaluation of the effectiveness of your ERM framework, or you may need to include compliance elements in your reporting due to the way that your risk oversight is managed within the organisation. And as such, reporting can be a daunting task. We all know that board and executive committee members can be high maintenance stakeholders, and yet sometimes we have to be able to convey the risk information in a way that is clear, concise and complete. Now, the board is always looking at the quality of talent in the organisation, so make your capability evident in the excellence of your board reporting. So how can we do this? Well, let's put the report into context. Risk reporting is an opportunity to show how an organisation is on top of its risks. It should be able to demonstrate that management and the board or board committees understand what the risks are, why they're taking them, and that they have considered what they need to do about them. Risk reporting that simply lists risks is one of the several ways that ERM can fall into the dreaded check the box trap. If you're not providing any real-time insights, you're merely providing a pretty picture that documents what people already know. And board members and executives will eventually begin questioning the value of ERM in this situation. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the board looking for in a risk report? Ask yourself, what do they want to know? not what you want to tell them. What is it that they can expect? They want assurance that they can understand the risks to their organisation's objectives and are taking appropriate action to address them in a way that they want them to be addressed so that they can fulfil their oversight responsibilities. So this means you need to think about how you convey this information. How do you want to deliver this message? And finally, whilst this report will be high level, it should also be able to prompt further discussion on how to proceed, whether that involves mitigation actions or a complete change in strategy. So let's look at the must-haves in a board report. First off, you need a description of the risk or the threat, including any assumptions made. Risks must be described in a way that your audience can understand it and its contents. So often we just see the title of the risk in the report, such as risk of flooding, which is probably not a great way to describe a risk, as the board will interpret this in multiple ways and they will make their own assumptions. However, if you provided them with a cause and the possible effects of this risk, it will help considerably. If the risk has no context, then how can you expect the board to understand what the risk is and how it affects them? You need to be able to articulate the impacts and likelihood of the risk occurring. This can be qualitative or quantitative assessment. Either approach will help them determine the priorities for risk mitigation. Mitigation plan information is critical as to ensure that the risks are capable of being mitigated to the level that the board are willing to take. And this will include the assurance that the risk management controls or mitigation is in place, and should also provide the information on the effectiveness of those controls of the mitigation plans. So why do we need these elements above all others? And why are these the ones we tend to report on? Well, research carried out by the CB back in 2014 indicated that most of the generated conversations in the board and executive risk meetings are around mitigation plans, about 33% of the conversation. Then they like to discuss the rating of the risks. This is about 29% of the conversation. And then we get a huge drop to about 10%, which is where they are looking at a targeted risk review, sometimes known as a deep dive. Personally, I think the reason why so much time, over a quarter of the conversation, is spent on ranking the risks is because the board is trying to figure out which risk is the most important and for what reasons. So perhaps with better reporting, less time would be spent on deciding if a risk is number 3 or number 4, but rather the discussions can be focused on the progress to achieving the intended outcome of that risks management plan. So if you want boards to have a robust conversation around mitigation plans, you must therefore have a clearly articulated risk, that they have to be able to understand the exposure to the organisation that they are potentially open to see what the plan is, and finally, understand if the plan is working and how effective it is at addressing that risk. And this is what interests the boards. So we need to be able to provide this information, as said previously, clearly, concisely, and completely. So there is other information that we should provide, as this will help to enrich the risk information and enhance the conversation. It may even help the board to think about risks a bit differently. The core of risk management is to identify the events that could impact on the organisation's objectives. Objectives usually being set to achieve the strategy. So your report should be able to demonstrate the links between risks and strategy. Ask yourself if you're doing this. There should be clear transparency with regard to the interconnectivity of risks. We often hear about risks being managed in silos, and yet we fail to make the interconnectivity clear at board level reporting. And where possible, provide quantitative information to help inform viability statements and stress testing. Usually there are financial ratings calculated even in qualitative risk assessments, such as a high cost impact is 300,000 to 500,000. And yet when it comes to providing the heat map, only the high, medium and low text is shown. And I bet if you ask the question, what does high cost impact mean? Most board members will have forgotten the relational value. So let's keep reminding them of the cost impact of the risk should it occur. Providing the time frame for risks, this is in terms of when your exposure could start and its end point, and also in terms of time you may want to consider velocity, also known as the speed of onset, in which the risk or threat could occur. Key risk reporting, and I don't just mean KPIs, which tend to be lagging, where possible should also be provided. And all this will enable your board to take action before the risk occurs. And finally, you may want to include some information based on your horizon scanning, i.e. potential new risks as a result of a change in work environment, legislation changes, geopolitical changes, etc. So these are the could-haves that could be used to enrich your report. So we know the information we must or could include, but now we need to think about how we can present this information. We all know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So for reporting, whilst perhaps not pictures, graphics are a great way of helping the board quickly see the information they need and to prompt discussion to enable them to proceed in their management of risk. But before you decide on the graphic you want to use, you need to think about the message you are trying to give. For each potential graphic, ask yourself, what's the purpose of the graphic? What are you trying to show? And then, what graphics would provide the best visual metaphor for the message that you wish to convey? Information. What data do you want to show? Is the data qualitative or quantitative? And what's going to be compelling and memorable? And finally, think of your audience. Ask yourself, what is the level of knowledge or expertise of the audience to who you're presenting? Know the professional backgrounds and skill sets of your board committee members to help you prepare the most persuasive presentation and facilitate discussion. For examples, those from an accounting, finance and treasury background may prefer a more quantitative approach to reporting than those, say, in HR or sales, who would prefer a more qualitative approach. So, knowing what message you want to give, with what information, and to whom you are going to give it, what sort of graphics could we use? We are all familiar with the traditional PID, and we either present two PIDs, one showing the current or pre-assessment, and another PID next to this, showing the target or post-assessment. And sometimes we have both on the same PID and an arrow linking the scenarios. So the first presentation means that your audience has to play spot the difference. And the latter sometimes looks like a spider's just crawled all over your graphic. And neither of which, I think, helps your board understand that journey that they need to take to improve upon their risk management. But what if we were to turn the PID into something more like this? This way, you can see where you were, where you are, and where you need to be. And more importantly, you can discuss the level of effort needed to reach to where you want to go. So while this example was built in ERM tool, you could easily create this in any of the Microsoft Office tools. So how can we help the board to see this risk journey? Heat maps have their place. But one thing boards want to know is what they can expect to see going forwards, and are mitigations on track. Usually, board level risk reporting focus on the high level or strategic risks, which rightly require strategic mitigations. And such risk mitigations will take a considerable period of time to action and embed, especially if you're in a large organisation. So for example, putting in a whole new health and safety improvement plan in place is not something you could expect to achieve or see the results of within a few weeks. So using graphics to capture anticipated outcomes generates discussion, either to dampen the risk owner's optimism, challenge non-movement of risk positions, or generate investigatory discussion if the movement was not as expected. Forecasting, as an added bonus for you, can help the focus of the minds of those risk owners who perhaps do not see risk management as a top priority, and they will be forced to think and not just reflect. And this also helps drive the improvement actions, as they will want to be the ones explaining to the board why the anticipated outcomes for the current reported period were not as forecasted. And in this example, completed in Excel, the colours of the cell indicates the severity of the risk, the arrow, the direction of travel of the risk, and the boards tend to like to see the risk movement over time. And also this highlights that risks can go up as well as down, depending what's going on both inside and outside of the organisation. And it helps them to remember that risk management is fluid. Now, if you want to enhance your journey of risk information, you can create something a bit more complex, as with this example. This waterfall graphic is designed to demonstrate the risk movement and its severity over time. The dotted lines is the expected trajectory of the risk, and the text boxes would be completed to explain the rationale of these movements. Whilst a bit harder to set up, once you have this graphic completed, it's only a matter of updating the red line for each reporting period, and better still, get your risk owner to update their own chart and with their own text. Make your board reporting easy. What if we were to look at risk through other dimensions? Most of the time, risks are presented with the likelihood and severity and the score. Even more often, risks are ranked in order of that score and with a focus tending then to be on the red risks. But what if you brought in the concept of velocity? Velocity being the speed of onset of the risk should it occur. Now this can significantly change the focus of risk discussion. Looking at the risks above, suddenly risk A would have a greater focus than risk B, even though its severity score is lower than risk B. High velocity risks tend to generate discussions on response plans and may even help you to get traction on carrying out stress tests for such risks. This type of discussion and focus should also help you with any viability statements that may have to be produced as part of your annual reporting and accounts, and that's if you fall within your external requirements. Getting boards to think about the speed of onset should a risk occur will help them to focus on not just the preemptive controls or mitigations, but also those needed to respond to a risk should it be realised. risks with a focus on when the risk could occur is another option for you. Usually the start date of the risk is often only provided in tabular form somewhere in the risk report, and this means that the time elements can sometimes be lost in reporting. However, presenting the risks as to when these could happen is a great way of generating the focus on the short to mid-term risks, especially if you're reporting on a time-bound project or if you know you have limited time to discuss the risks. My last qualitative graphic is around horizon scanning. Horizon scanning and velocity make for a good partnership, not just because you can get 2 dimensions on a single graphic, but it helps boards to understand what is coming their way and how quickly these could materialise. It is also important to note, when visualising emerging risks for your board in this way, that what you put on there is relevant or potentially relevant to the organisation. And check that the risks are assessed in accordance to the organisation's risk assessment policies and practices. Now, I suggest you may only present this once or a year, perhaps every 6 months, depending what's going on, but not every single report. But what horizon scanning does is allows the board to take a step back and remind themselves of the environment in which they're operating. It's also a great litmus test and will help the board to identify points of interest to them, and also allows you to then carry out further investigation into these emerging risk areas and update them on the next reporting period. Now, this can only but help for you to be seen as a trusted risk manager and support to the board. And it's this type of work that will keep your board engaged in the risk management process. Now, not all reporting can be or should be presented graphically. For all deep dives, for example, you may want to provide more detail, which would be hard to determine from a high visual. Presenting risk information on a single page is always a good start. No one wants to read War and Peace, but remember, if you are lucky enough to be presenting to the board, have any additional information to hand when the board start to drill down into the weeds, because they will. Champion the option of having the actual risk owner to do the specific presentation for any deep dive reviews. Not only will this make it easier for you, but reinforces the aspect of accountability and responsibility for the driving of mitigation for that specific risk. Now, up until now, I've included only qualitative graphics, but there are ways of providing quantitative information in a way that is informative and yet not be overwhelming to those board members who don't have a quantitative background. The most typical example you'll see is the cost risk analysis, or CRA, which is designed to indicate the additional costs of your risks to the project. Now, the purpose of this graph is to stimulate discussions, especially across functions such as finance and estimators, etc. Now, usually I appreciate that the detailed discussion will have taken place below board level, and that the board would get presented with just the 90, 50 and 10% levels. And they should have the assurance that the challenge has taken place before these figures are provided to them. However, sometimes it may be worth providing such a graphic, even as an appendix, just to remind them that the quantitative assessments have been taking place. We can also make quants appear in a way that the board can relate to. Remember, we said that boards spend about a quarter of their time identifying how to rank risks or their importance. And whilst the previous graphic was around the collective risks to the project, by presenting a tornado graphic, we can highlight the risks that have the greatest impact on the CRA. And this in itself helps to rank those risks. This enables the boards to focus on these risks, as this is where you'll get the most leverage from changes made. Our final graphic is an example of a dashboard in use to help you understand the performance of the type of key risk indicators that you could have around risk. Now, very often risk management and the understanding of controls, compliance and their effectiveness are reported in the same report. However, most reports still focus on the performance, i.e. lagging indicators, rather than the leading. Effective risk management must have leading indicators if you're going to actively manage your risk. Otherwise, you're managing an issue because that risk will have occurred. Now, this is possibly one of the hardest elements of reporting to pull together, as it usually involves a number of different stakeholders and is generally when you discover that you don't actually have the measures by which you can adequately monitor performance. In this example, we have the concept, period by period, and reports on the following elements: the progress to the mitigation plan, the tolerance levels, risk indicators, and compliance and assurance activities. Now, the compliance and assurance activities are your first, second, and third line of defence activities. Now, I want to emphasise that risk reporting is very organisation specific. The contents of a report and how it's formatted depends on a variety of factors, which we've already covered, i.e. the needs of the users, their professional backgrounds, and the skill sets of the audience and other individual specific factors. But I'm just going to finish by running through, from experience, some of the key elements that I try to keep in mind when writing a report. Length. Try to keep your reporting as succinct as possible. As your board gain their trust in you, you should be able to reduce your volume of reporting, maybe even move towards exception reporting. Be pragmatic and report what they will see as a sensible report and not report what you want to report. Remember, this is not a vanity check. Consistency. Whilst risk management is fluid, so too may be your reporting requirements, especially if an event occurs. However, try to keep your reporting approach as consistent as possible with key information, and anything out of the ordinary can be managed with annexes or supplementary papers. Engage with the board. Make time to have catch-up sessions with board members on a one-to-one basis. They should not be seeing you once per quarter. They should be in a position where they need and want to engage with you as part of their risk management. So earn their trust. Now, appreciating that the hierarchy can play a key role in reporting, if you can, when doing deep dives, get the risk owners to attend that part of the meeting when discussing that specific risk. Remember, nearly a third of the time of the conversation boards like to have is around the mitigation. The ERM team, as in you, actually play a limited role in driving those strategies. So think how much richer the conversation can be if you enable the risk owner to present that information. Plus, they have to answer the awkward questions that the boards may ask. Boards like to be talked to, not at. Talking to the board will help them with their understanding of risk and risk management. Now, the CEB Risk Management Oversight Survey in 2014 indicated that those boards that have a robust knowledge of ERM had improved satisfaction levels of their risk reports. So use your graphics and your engagement tactics to help educate your board. Do not report surprises. No board likes surprises, but unfortunately, bad things happen. Now, if you're proactively engaging with your board, then they will be appraised of any events well in advance before any risk reporting is required. You'll also usually find out not only do they appreciate this, but they tend to be more willing partners and supportive of you when it comes to the board meeting itself, if a risk has materialised. And don't feel pressurised to include certain elements in your report, especially if the organisation isn't ready for them or if the risk process itself doesn't support those elements yet. Remember, educate, not confused. And finally, just remember that the process and format for reporting in your organisation is a constantly evolving process. You will always think of new ways on how to help your board carry out their oversight duties. And I hope that this presentation has given you some ideas and things to think about on how to improve your reporting and, above all, make it easier for you. Thank you.